Welcome to your storytelling. Enjoy the stories, and don't forget to subscribe. You know that feeling when everything in your life just seems perfect? Like all the pieces have fallen into place, and you can finally breathe, finally be happy? That was me. I had spent months planning the perfect wedding, down to the smallest detail. The flowers, the music, the dress. I had dreamed of this moment since I was a little girl. And standing there, in my gown, with my mother adjusting my veil, I felt like the luckiest woman alive. I was marrying the man I loved, the man who had shown me what true love was. Our relationship had been a dream. At least, that's what I thought. He was charming, kind, and so deeply in love with me that I never once doubted us. My family adored him. My friends envied our love story, and I was about to walk down the aisle to officially start forever. I could hear the murmurs of our guests, the faint sounds of the string quartet playing the song we had chosen together. Butterflies fluttered in my stomach as I took one last deep breath. This was it, the moment I had been waiting for my whole life. Nothing could ruin this day, or so I thought, because just as I took my first step down the aisle, just as my eyes met his and I felt that rush of love all over again, a voice cut through the air like a knife. Stop the wedding. At first, I thought I'd imagined it. My heart was pounding so loudly in my ears that the words felt distant, like an echo. But then I saw the faces. Every head turned toward the back of the venue, eyes wide, mouths slightly open in shock. My steps faltered, and my father, holding my arm, glanced at me with confusion. Stop the wedding. The voice rang out again, clearer this time, cutting through the soft music and hushed whispers. I turned my head, following everyone's gaze, and there she was, standing at the entrance, bold and uninvited. A woman I'd never seen before. She wasn't a guest, not someone I'd overlooked on the seating chart. She was a stranger. Yet the way she stood there, so confident, so certain, sent a chill through me. She was dressed simply, nothing like the elegantly dressed guests. Her hair was slightly tousled as if she'd rushed to get here. But it was her eyes that struck me, fierce, determined, and locked onto mine. My fiancé's hand slipped from his side, his face paling as recognition flickered in his eyes. He knew her, and that was the moment my heart began to crack. Silence swallowed the room. The music stopped mid-note, the tension thick enough to suffocate. I stood frozen, clutching my bouquet so tightly my knuckles turned white. My father whispered, "Do you know her?" I shook my head, unable to form words. The woman took a deep breath, her voice trembling but loud enough for everyone to hear. "You can't marry him," she said, her eyes never leaving mine. "Because I slept with your fiancé." Gasps erupted from the guests, a wave of shock rippling through the room. My legs felt weak, my vision blurred. I turned slowly to my fiancé, searching his face for denial, for outrage, for anything that would tell me this was some sick joke. But he didn't say a word. His mouth opened slightly, then closed. His eyes darted between me and the woman at the door. "Tell me she's lying," I whispered, my voice barely audible. But he said nothing, and that silence was louder than her words. The weight of his silence crushed me. My heart screamed for him to deny it, to fight for me, but he just stood there, paralyzed, guilty written all over his face. I could barely breathe. My father's hand gripped my arm, steadying me as my knees threatened to give out. "Prove it," I finally spat, my voice trembling with rage and disbelief. "If you're going to ruin my wedding, you better have proof." The woman didn't flinch. She reached into her small purse and pulled out her phone. With swift, practiced motions, she swiped through her screen and held it up for everyone to see. Photos, text messages, dates, receipts from hotels. The evidence flashed before my eyes like scenes from a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. Whispers grew louder among the guests, people shifting uncomfortably in their seats. My mother's hand covered her mouth, her eyes filled with tears. I turned back to my fiancé. He was as pale as a ghost, his eyes pleading silently, but he still didn't speak. That was when I knew. He didn't have to say a word, because the truth was written all over his face. I stood there, clutching my bouquet like it was the only thing anchoring me to reality. The photos burned into my mind. Him with her. In places he told me he was busy with work. My heart raced, pounding so loud I could barely hear the whispers spreading like wildfire among the guests. He finally broke the silence. "It's not what it looks like," he muttered, his voice shaky, eyes darting from me to her, then back again. "Not what it looks like." My hands trembled, my chest tightening with a mix of rage and heartbreak. "Then what is it?" I snapped, my voice sharp, slicing through the tension. "Because it looks like you've been cheating on me." He took a step forward, his face pale. "It happened before we got engaged." It meant nothing. I swear. Before we got engaged? As if that made it better. As if that erased the betrayal. My fingers loosened, and the bouquet slipped from my hand, falling to the floor with a soft thud that felt deafening in the heavy silence. Nothing would ever feel the same again. His words echoed in my head. It happened before we got engaged. Like there was some magical boundary that made infidelity acceptable as long as it didn't happen after a ring was involved. I opened my mouth to respond, but the woman spoke first. "That's not the whole story," she said, stepping forward. The boldness in her voice had softened, but her eyes still burned with determination. "I didn't come here to ruin your day for fun. I came because you deserve to know the truth." The truth. Like I hadn't already been sucker-punched with enough of it. "Oh, there's more?" I asked bitterly, my voice laced with sarcasm, but fear twisted in my gut. She hesitated for just a second before blurting out, "I'm pregnant." The words hit me harder than anything else. Pregnant. My world tilted, the edges of my vision blurring. My knees buckled slightly, and my mother rushed to steady me. I looked at him, desperately searching for denial, for anger, for anything. But he just stood there, silent, guilty, broken. And so was I. The room erupted into whispers again, a chorus of disbelief and scandal. I couldn't hear any of it clearly. My heart was pounding too fast, drowning out everything except the echo of her words. "I'm pregnant." I stared at my fiancé, the man I thought I knew, the man who was supposed to be my forever. His lips moved, but no sound came out at first. Then finally, a weak, trembling whisper. "I didn't know." I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was ridiculous. "You didn't know?" I repeated, my voice rising with every word. "You didn't know? Are you serious right now?" He reached out to me, but I stepped back like his touch might burn me. "I never wanted to hurt you," he pleaded, his face crumpling with regret, or maybe just fear of losing me. The woman crossed her arms. "You hurt both of us," she snapped, her eyes narrowing. "You lied to me too." It hit me then. This wasn't just my betrayal. He'd been living a double life, deceiving both of us. And I didn't know which was worse, that he'd cheated, or that he'd been so good at hiding it. I felt like I was drowning, gasping for air in a room, full of people who were all breathing just fine. My perfect wedding had crumbled, replaced by this nightmare, and I couldn't escape it. My fiancé, no, the man I thought I knew, stood there, his face a portrait of guilt, regret, and desperation. "I didn't think it mattered," he blurted out, his voice shaky. I froze. The words hung in the air, heavier than the silence that followed. Didn't think it mattered? My heart clenched so tightly it hurt. "It didn't matter?" I whispered, my voice dangerously low. "You didn't think your betrayal mattered?" His face turned red, eyes darting around as if searching for an exit. "I mean, it was a mistake. A one-time thing. But it wasn't. The texts, the photos, the pregnancy. It wasn't just a mistake. It was a choice. Over and over again. And that's when I realized this wasn't just about one moment. This was who he really was." I stared at him, trying to reconcile the man standing there with the man I had fallen in love with. The man who left me little notes in my lunch, who held me when I cried, who promised me forever. Was it all a lie? Or had I been too blind to see the truth? "Did you love her?" I asked suddenly, my voice trembling. I didn't even know why I asked. I wasn't sure which answer would hurt more. He hesitated. That pause told me everything before he even opened his mouth. "No," he finally whispered, but his eyes betrayed him. He wasn't sure. Maybe he was lying again. Maybe he didn't even know the answer himself. The woman let out a bitter laugh. Funny. That's not what you said to me. The words sliced through me like glass. I felt exposed, humiliated, standing there in my wedding dress, the symbol of a future that no longer existed. And the worst part? I still wanted to believe him. I looked down at the bouquet lying on the floor, petals scattered like the pieces of my heart. I'd picked those flowers with so much care, imagining how beautiful they'd look as I walked toward the man I loved. Now, they were just wilted reminders of everything I'd lost in a single moment. Why didn't you tell me? I whispered, my voice barely audible over the murmur of the crowd. He stepped forward, reaching for me again, but I flinched. Because I was afraid, he said. Afraid of losing you. I let out a hollow laugh. Well, congratulations. You managed to lose me anyway. The room grew quiet, the weight of my words settling over everyone like a heavy fog. I felt my mother's hand on my shoulder, steady and comforting, but nothing could ground me now. I wasn't just heartbroken. I was furious. Furious that he'd stolen my wedding day, my future, my faith in love. And in that moment, I knew. This wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning. The silence in the room was deafening. I could feel hundreds of eyes on me. Family, friends, strangers, all witnessing the unraveling of my life. But none of them mattered. Only he did. Or at least, he used to. I stared at him, my mind racing with questions I wasn't sure I wanted answers to. How long? I asked quietly, my voice brittle like thin glass. His eyes flickered, filled with a mix of guilt and fear. It was just a few times, he mumbled. A few times. The words hit me harder than if he'd said it had been an affair for years. A few times meant it wasn't even something meaningful. He risked everything, for nothing. The woman crossed her arms, scoffing. A few times? Don't downplay it now. My stomach twisted. I didn't want to hear more, but I couldn't stop myself. Were you ever going to tell me? I whispered. He shook his head slowly, tears filling his eyes. No, he admitted. I thought it was over, but it wasn't over. It had only just begun. As I stood there, surrounded by people I loved, I'd never felt more alone. My bridesmaids looked at me with pity. My mother's face was streaked with tears, and my father's jaw was clenched so tightly I thought he might explode. But no one could fix this. I looked back at the woman, the stranger who knew my fiancé better than I did. Why now? I asked her. Why today? She shrugged slightly, her expression softening. Because I didn't know until recently. And when I found out, I thought you deserved to know before it was too late. Before it was too late. But it was already too late. My fiancé tried to step closer again, but I held up my hand, stopping him mid-stride. Don't, I whispered. I couldn't bear to have him near me. His presence felt like poison, seeping into the air around me. I thought I knew him, but the man standing in front of me was a stranger wearing the face of someone I used to love. My heart felt too big for my chest, pounding painfully as if trying to break free. I wanted to scream, to cry, to run, but my legs refused to move. I was trapped in this beautiful nightmare, wrapped in white lace and shattered dreams. I was going to marry you, I whispered, my voice thick with tears I refused to let fall. I was going to spend my life with you. His face crumpled. You still can, he pleaded, his voice desperate. We can fix this. Fix this? As if this was some broken vase we could glue back together, pretending the cracks weren't there. No, I said, my voice suddenly steadier than I felt. We can't. His face twisted with panic. Please, I love you. But love wasn't enough. Not anymore. I looked around the room, at the decorations I'd agonized over, the people who'd come to celebrate us, the life I'd dreamed of. And then I turned back to him, the man I thought I'd spend forever with. You don't get to have me, I whispered. And with that, I finally found the strength to walk away. Walking away felt like moving through water, heavy, slow, suffocating. My dress, once a symbol of joy, now clung to me like a burden. Each step echoed in the silent room, my heels clicking against the floor, the sound louder than the whispers that followed me. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I was afraid that if I saw his face one more time, I might crumble. My mother rushed after me, her voice a soft plea. "Sweetheart, are you okay?" Was I okay? The question felt absurd. My heart had been ripped out in front of everyone I loved. But I nodded anyway because admitting the truth felt too raw. We reached a small room off to the side, a dressing room where I'd put on my veil just an hour ago, full of excitement and dreams. Now it felt like a prison. I sank onto the velvet chair, my hands trembling in my lap. I was supposed to be a bride. Instead, I was just broken. The quiet in that small room was deafening, interrupted only by my ragged breathing. My mother sat beside me, her hand warm on mine, but even her comfort felt distant, like I was trapped behind a wall of glass. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. But it wasn't her fault. It wasn't even the woman's fault. It was his. The man I trusted with my heart, my future. He'd shattered both without hesitation. A knock sounded at the door. My heart clenched instinctively. My mother stood up, opening it just a crack. I heard his voice, soft and pleading. "Please, let me talk to her." I shook my head immediately. I couldn't face him. Not yet. Maybe not ever. My mother closed the door gently, her eyes full of questions she didn't ask. She didn't need to. The answer was written all over my face. I wasn't sure if I hated him more for what he did, or for making me still love him despite it. I sat there for what felt like hours, staring at the floor, my wedding dress crumpled around me like a ghost of what could have been. The makeup artist's careful work had long since been ruined by tears I didn't remember crying. My phone buzzed on the table beside me. I glanced at it, his name flashing across the screen. My chest tightened. I didn't answer. I couldn't. What would I even say? That he destroyed me? That I hated him? That, deep down, a part of me still wanted to believe he loved me enough to make this all a nightmare I could wake up from? But this was real. I stood up, staring at my reflection in the mirror. I looked like a stranger. Mascara streaks, red-rimmed eyes, a wedding dress that no longer belonged to a bride. With trembling fingers, I reached up and pulled off my veil. And with it, I let go of the life I thought I was going to have. I stared at my reflection, the woman in the mirror looking nothing like the one who'd woken up that morning, filled with hope. My perfect curls were falling loose, smudged makeup painting the aftermath of heartbreak across my face. I took a deep breath, trying to steady the storm inside me, but my chest felt too tight. My wedding dress, once a dream, now felt like a cage. I fumbled with the zipper, my fingers trembling. My mother rushed over to help, her hands gentle as she slid it down. The dress pooled at my feet, and I stood there in nothing but my slip, feeling exposed in more ways than one. Stripped of love, trust, and the illusion of forever. My phone buzzed again. Another call from him. I didn't answer, but part of me wanted to. Part of me wanted to scream at him, demand explanations, force him to feel the weight of my pain. But I knew better. No explanation could ever fix what he broke. After slipping into simple clothes, a dress I'd brought for the honeymoon, I sat quietly, staring at the door. The same door he'd knocked on earlier. The barrier between us felt both paper-thin and impenetrable. Another soft knock. His voice, low and desperate, filtered through. "Please, just let me explain." Explain? What was left to say? The truth had already been laid out in texts, photos, and the woman's trembling voice. I didn't move. My mother stood protectively near me, her face a mixture of sadness and fury. "She doesn't want to talk," she said firmly through the door. Silence followed, then footsteps fading away. And with every step he took, it felt like the final nails in the coffin of our relationship. I thought closure came with conversations and goodbyes. But sometimes, it's just the sound of someone walking away, and you not stopping them. Eventually, I had to leave that room. I couldn't hide forever. The reception hall was still filled with guests, their faces painted with awkward sympathy. Whispers floated in the air like smoke, impossible to ignore. I walked through them, my head held high even though my heart felt shattered. Some people tried to offer comforting words, but I didn't need them. I needed space. When I reached the exit, I paused, glancing back one last time. The decorations, the flowers, the empty chairs. It all felt like a staged play where the script had gone horribly wrong. And then I saw him, standing in the corner, alone, his face etched with regret. Our eyes met for a fleeting moment. He looked like he wanted to rush over, to fix what he'd broken. But I turned away, because some mistakes don't deserve second chances. And he was mine. The ride home felt surreal. My mother sat beside me in silence, her hand occasionally brushing mine, as if to remind me I wasn't entirely alone. But I felt alone, utterly, painfully alone. I stared out the window, watching the world pass by like it belonged to someone else. The wedding dress was gone, but the weight of the day clung to me like an invisible shroud. My phone buzzed again. Another message from him. I didn't read it. I couldn't. The words would only reopen wounds that hadn't even begun to scab. I thought about the little details I'd obsessed over for months. The perfect invitations, the color palette, the cake tasting. All meaningless now. But it wasn't just the wedding I'd lost. It was the future I'd built in my mind. The home, the kids, the growing old together. And no matter how far the car drove, I couldn't leave that heartbreak behind. When I finally walked into my apartment, the silence hit me like a wave. This place had been our sanctuary, filled with laughter, plans, and whispered dreams late into the night. Now it felt like a hollow shell. I dropped my bag by the door and stood there, unsure of what to do next. The framed photos on the wall mocked me, smiling faces frozen in time, blissfully unaware of the betrayal lurking in the future. I walked to the bedroom, the scent of him still lingering on the pillows. My chest tightened. I wanted to scream, to rip the sheets off, to erase every trace of him. But instead, I sank onto the bed, my body folding under the weight of exhaustion and grief. For the first time since that awful moment at the altar, I let myself cry. Really cry. Loud, messy sobs that shook my entire body. I wasn't crying because he cheated. I was crying because I'd loved him enough to forgive anything, except this. The next morning, the sunlight felt intrusive, spilling into the room like it didn't know my world had ended. I rolled over, my eyes swollen and heavy, and saw my phone blinking with notifications. Dozens of messages, all from him. I'm sorry. Please talk to me. I didn't mean to hurt you. I love you. I stared at the screen, my heart a tangled mess of anger, sadness, and the remnants of love that refused to disappear overnight. I wanted to respond, to tell him how much he'd destroyed, to make him feel even a fraction of the pain he'd caused me. But I didn't. Instead, I turned off my phone, placed it face down on the nightstand, and stared at the ceiling. Sometimes silence speaks louder than words, and he didn't deserve mine anymore. I spent the next few days in a fog. The world outside my apartment continued on, oblivious to the storm I was living through. I barely ate, barely slept. My mind kept replaying the wedding day over and over, as if by some miracle, the moment would change. But it never did. It was hard to face reality, harder than I'd imagined. Everything I thought I knew was a lie. Every moment of joy had been tainted. My dreams of the future were reduced to a shattered, unrecognizable mess. But eventually, the numbness wore off. Slowly, I began to take small steps, cleaning out the apartment, tossing out the wedding invitations I'd spent months perfecting, packing away the framed photos. It wasn't easy. Each action felt like I was dismantling my life, piece by piece. But in doing so, I was also building something new. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing. I wasn't going to let him define it. Weeks passed. I had stopped checking my phone for messages from him. I had stopped wondering if he was truly sorry. I started seeing a therapist, something I had avoided before, convinced that I could handle everything on my own. But I couldn't. It felt good to talk to someone who wasn't invested in the situation, someone who didn't judge or offer empty advice. She helped me realize that healing wasn't about forgiveness, at least not yet. It was about learning to live without the man who had once been my world. I started doing things for myself. I went out with friends. I reconnected with hobbies I'd forgotten. I even took a weekend trip to the beach, just to remind myself that the world was bigger than the tiny corner I'd been living in. It was strange, somehow freeing. I had forgotten what it felt like to exist outside of my relationship. One day, As I was walking through the park, lost in my thoughts, I saw him. I froze. My heart skipped a beat, then started racing. He was standing there, his hands in his pockets, looking exactly the same, except that he seemed smaller, diminished somehow. The man I had once loved was now just a shadow of the person I had known. He saw me, and for a moment, neither of us moved. The space between us felt like an entire lifetime. He opened his mouth to speak, but I shook my head, cutting him off. "I don't want to hear it," I said, my voice firmer than I thought it would be. He closed his eyes, a painful expression crossing his face. "I understand," he whispered, and for the first time, I believed he did. I turned away and kept walking, the sound of my footsteps the only thing that remained between us. The encounter with him stayed with me for days. It had been almost too easy to walk away from him, to keep moving forward without looking back. Yet the tightness in my chest remained, a reminder of everything I'd lost. But I wasn't that girl anymore, the one who clung to the idea of a perfect love, a perfect future. I had learned to let go, to accept that some things in life could never be fixed, no matter how much I wished they could. I focused on building a life for myself. I started working on projects I had put off, creative endeavors I'd abandoned in the past. Slowly, the pieces of me that had been broken began to heal. I wasn't whole, not yet, but I was learning how to breathe without him, how to smile without pretending. And for the first time in a long time, I felt a glimmer of hope. One evening, as I sat on my couch, sipping tea and reading a book, a sudden wave of clarity washed over me. I had spent so much time feeling like a victim in this story, helpless and betrayed. But I wasn't a victim. I was a survivor. I had faced the worst moment of my life and come out the other side. The pain wasn't gone, not yet, but it didn't control me anymore. I thought about my future, my career, my dreams, the person I wanted to become. I had all the time in the world to redefine myself. It was empowering, realizing that I held the power to choose my own path. For the first time since that fateful day, I stood up, not as someone broken, but as someone who had survived the worst and was ready to rise again. A few months passed. I continued to move forward, one step at a time. The pain ebbed, but the scars remained. A part of me now. I started to find peace in the simple things. A quiet afternoon, a conversation with a friend, a good book. Then one day, as I was sitting at a cafe, lost in my thoughts, I saw an unfamiliar face. It was a woman who seemed to be looking around, as if waiting for someone. She caught my eye, and something in her expression stopped me. It was familiar, a kind of hurt I recognized. She smiled hesitantly, then walked over. "You don't know me," she began softly, "but I'm the woman your fiancé was with. Before you two broke up." I felt my heart stop. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. But then I steadied myself. "Thank you for coming," I said, my voice surprisingly calm. She sat down across from me, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "I just wanted to apologize. I didn't know about you. And when I found out, I felt terrible." I nodded slowly, the weight of the moment settling in. She wasn't the enemy, and she wasn't the cause of my pain. The betrayal had come from him, not her. "I forgive you," I said softly, and in that moment, I realized something important. Healing wasn't about holding on to anger. It was about letting go of the things that no longer served me: resentment, regret, and pain. And for the first time in months, I felt a sense of closure. The days that followed that unexpected meeting with the woman felt like a turning point. It wasn't that I'd magically forgiven him or erased the hurt, but there was a shift inside me, a realization that I no longer wanted to carry the weight of the past with me. I had spent too much time defining myself by the betrayal, by what he had done to me. But that was just one chapter in a much bigger story. So I began to refocus. I poured my energy into my passions, things I'd forgotten about during the relationship. I worked on projects at the office that I'd once been too distracted to invest in. I started exercising, pushing my body to do things I thought I was too weak to handle. And slowly, the person I was before him began to return. It wasn't an instant transformation, but each day brought me closer to the woman I was meant to be, before I lost myself in someone else. One evening, I found myself out with friends. We had dinner at a new restaurant that everyone had been raving about, and the conversation flowed effortlessly. It felt good to laugh, to feel like myself again. As we talked about life, work, and everything in between, I realized how much I'd missed this, the connection, the warmth of being around people who truly cared for me. It had been so easy to isolate myself after everything that happened. I didn't want to face the world, didn't want to explain what had happened or why. But I had underestimated the strength of my circle of friends. They didn't need explanations. They just wanted to see me happy again. And slowly, I let them back in. I realized that healing wasn't a solitary journey. It was one I shared with the people who cared about me most. It had been months since I'd seen him last. I had no intention of ever seeing him again, and yet, there he was, standing in front of me on a quiet street corner, looking as if he had aged 10 years in the short time since we'd parted. I froze. My pulse quickened. For a split second, everything felt like it was spiraling back to the moment when everything had fallen apart. But then, I took a deep breath. I was different now, stronger, more aware of who I was and what I deserved. He looked at me with the same regretful expression that had once shattered me. "I never stopped loving you," he said, his voice strained. I didn't respond right away. Instead, I studied him, this man who had once been my everything, the man who had destroyed everything we had for the thrill of something else. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I know I hurt you, and I'll never forgive myself for that." I nodded slowly, my heart no longer aching the way it used to. "I've moved on," I said, my voice steady and calm. And with that, I turned away. I wasn't angry. I wasn't sad. I was simply done. I continued to grow. Every day felt like a small victory, even the ones that left me exhausted or uncertain. I had learned to love myself in ways I hadn't thought possible. For the first time in years, I wasn't afraid of being alone. I had faced my worst fears, the betrayal, the heartbreak, and come out the other side stronger. And while I wasn't rushing into another relationship, I found myself open to the possibility of love, but only when it felt right. One night, I had dinner with a man I had met through a mutual friend. He was kind, patient, and understanding. We talked for hours, finding common ground on everything from movies to our childhoods. But when he kissed me goodnight, I realized that while he was wonderful, he wasn't the one. And that was okay. I didn't need someone to complete me. I was already complete. As I embraced this new chapter of my life, I noticed something incredible. My friendships flourished. The people who had been there for me during the darkest moments were still by my side, offering support without hesitation. I took a weekend trip with my best friend to a cabin by the lake. It was quiet, peaceful, and exactly what I needed. We spent our days hiking, talking, and reflecting on life. In the quiet moments, I realized something profound. My life was no longer defined by the man who had broken my heart. It was defined by the people who had stuck around. My family, my friends, and the person I was becoming. The love I'd been seeking had always been there. It was in the connections I had built, not just the romantic relationships I'd once dreamed of. A few months later, I received an invitation. It was a wedding invitation, and at first, I didn't know who it was from. The name on the envelope was unfamiliar, but something about it tugged at me. I opened it and read the details. It was his wedding. I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me. There was no anger, no sadness, just a quiet acceptance of what had been. I had closed that chapter long ago, but the invitation remained in my hands, and I thought about what it meant. The life I had imagined with him, those dreams of marriage, children, and growing old together, wasn't mine anymore. And that was okay. I didn't need closure. I had already found it in the quiet moments of healing and growth. The next morning, I sent my RSVP. I wished him well, not out of obligation, but out of genuine peace. I had found my way forward, and I knew now that we both deserved happiness, just not with each other. The day of his wedding arrived, and I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of detachment as I prepared for it. I hadn't expected to feel anything, yet there was a subtle tug at my heart. It wasn't pain or longing. It was simply a reminder of what could have been. I arrived at the venue, an elegant estate surrounded by lush gardens, and took a deep breath as I stepped out of the car. The familiar faces of old friends were scattered across the room, exchanging pleasantries, while I stood there as a silent observer to someone else's happiness. The ceremony itself was beautiful. The couple exchanged vows with sincerity, surrounded by friends and family. As I watched them, I realized that the love they shared was theirs, untouched by my past and undiluted by what had come before. I congratulated him afterward, and when he smiled at me, there was no regret in his eyes, just a genuine wish for my happiness. And for the first time in a long time, I felt the weight of my own happiness unburdened by the past. As the years passed, I settled into a new rhythm of life. I moved into a new apartment, decorated it just the way I wanted, and took up new hobbies. I finally embraced my love for painting, something I had never had time for before. Life was no longer a series of trying to fix what was broken, but a continuous journey of self-discovery. I spent weekends with friends, traveled to places I'd only dreamed of, and allowed myself to experience the world in all its complexity. There were still days when loneliness crept in, but it wasn't the same kind of ache. It wasn't the desperation to fill a void with someone else's love. It was the quiet resilience that came from knowing I was enough. I wasn't perfect, but I was whole, and that was all that mattered. One afternoon, as I sat in a cozy cafe, sketching in my notebook, I saw someone familiar walk through the door. It was a face I hadn't seen in years, my old friend from college, the one who had known me before the heartbreak, before all the confusion. She spotted me almost instantly and made her way over, her smile warm and genuine. "I heard you were in town. It's been forever." We sat and talked for hours, catching up on everything. As the conversation flowed, I realized something remarkable. I wasn't the same person who had been devastated by betrayal. The woman sitting across from her was someone who had fought her way back from the depths of heartbreak. She was stronger, wiser, and infinitely more self-aware. In that moment, I felt a quiet pride, a recognition of the strength that had carried me through the darkest of days. And it was then I realized the journey had never been about finding closure from the past. It had been about rediscovering myself, and that was something I'd never lose again. It was a Saturday afternoon when my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. Hesitantly, I opened it, and my heart skipped when I saw the name. It was him. He hadn't reached out in years, and the message was simple: "Can we talk?" For a moment, I considered ignoring it. I had worked so hard to move on, to not be tethered to a past that had done nothing but hurt me. But curiosity gnawed at me. I had changed, and I wasn't afraid of him anymore. I typed out a response. "What do you want to talk about?" His reply was immediate. "I've never stopped thinking about you." I didn't know how to feel. Part of me wanted to give in, to hear him out, but another part of me felt the walls I had built around my heart tighten in defense. I put my phone down, unsure of what to do. The days following his message were filled with uncertainty. I went back and forth, wondering whether I should respond, meet with him, or just leave the past where it belonged. Finally, I made a decision. I wouldn't let him pull me back into a story that no longer fit who I had become. The girl who had been broken and betrayed was gone, replaced by someone who had learned the power of independence and self-worth. I drafted a message, my fingers steady on the keyboard. "I've moved on. I hope you find happiness, but it's not with me." I sent it and set my phone down, feeling an unexpected sense of peace. There was no closure to be found in him. The only closure I needed was the one I had already given myself. Months passed, and life continued to surprise me. I met someone new, not someone I had planned on meeting, but someone who entered my life quietly, without fanfare or grand declarations. His name was Luke. We met at a charity event, and there was an instant connection. It wasn't overwhelming or intense, but rather a calm certainty that grew over time. Luke wasn't perfect, but neither was I. We didn't rush into anything. We took our time, building a relationship based on trust, mutual respect, and shared values. For the first time since my world had been turned upside down, I wasn't comparing him to anyone else. I wasn't waiting for him to disappoint me or for things to fall apart. We simply existed together, enjoying the quiet moments as much as the adventurous ones. And in those moments, I realized that love wasn't something to be chased. It was something that happened when I stopped looking for it and started living fully. As I spent more time with Luke, I began to see a life unfolding that was completely different from the one I had once imagined. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and that was enough. We shared simple joys, long walks, spontaneous trips, nights cooking dinner together. I found myself laughing again, truly laughing in a way I hadn't in a long time. There was no pretension, no expectations, just a gentle, growing connection. One evening, after a quiet dinner, he held my hand and looked at me with such tenderness that I felt my heart stir. For the first time, I realized that what we had, was what I had been waiting for all along. It wasn't about grand gestures or fairy tale romance. It was about feeling safe, heard, and valued. And for the first time in years, I felt like I had found that. Even as I embraced this new relationship, a part of me remained hesitant. The walls I'd built around my heart were strong, and letting anyone in fully felt like a risk I wasn't sure I was ready to take. Luke could sense it. There were moments when I pulled away, when I kept things at a surface level, too afraid to expose the scars of my past. One night, after a quiet dinner, he sat down beside me on the couch. "You don't have to hide from me," he said gently, his eyes filled with understanding. "I'm not asking for perfection. I'm just asking for you to be real with me." It was exactly what I needed to hear. I had spent so long protecting myself from hurt that I had forgotten what it was like to simply trust. "I'm scared," I admitted, my voice barely a whisper. "I've been hurt so badly before. I don't know how to let go." He took my hand in his, squeezing it softly. "You don't have to let go all at once. But I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." It was a promise, a reassurance that I wasn't alone. The weeks that followed were filled with small moments of trust, each one leading me closer to the realization that I was ready to let go of my past. One afternoon, as Luke and I sat by the lake, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I found myself leaning into him, my head resting on his shoulder. It was in that simple gesture that I realized I had taken the leap. I had allowed myself to trust again, to love again. And for the first time, I didn't feel afraid. The pain of the past was still there, but it no longer defined me. I was free to create something new, something that was mine. And as I sat there with Luke, I knew that I had found the kind of love I deserved. One that wasn't perfect, but one that was real and grounded in the present, not the past. The journey wasn't over, but I was no longer walking it alone. As the months passed, Luke and I grew closer. We faced challenges together, like everyone does, but there was an ease in our relationship. We didn't try to change each other. We embraced each other's flaws and quirks and found beauty in the imperfections. One weekend, he surprised me with a trip to the coast, a place I had always wanted to visit but never got the chance. The fresh ocean air, the sound of the waves crashing, and the beautiful sunsets felt like a new beginning for us. We spent the days walking along the beach, holding hands, talking about everything and nothing. And as I stood there with him, watching the sky shift colors, I realized that this was the life I had been waiting for. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine, and it was enough. One evening, as we sat under the stars in the quiet of our backyard, Luke took my hand and looked at me with a seriousness that took me by surprise. "I know we've only been together for a short time," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion, "but I feel like I've known you forever. You've changed my life in ways I can't explain, and I can't imagine my future without you in it." I looked at him, unsure of where this was going. My heart began to race. "I love you," he said softly, "and I want to spend the rest of my life with you. Will you marry me?" I blinked, my breath catching in my throat. I hadn't expected this, not so soon. But there, in his eyes, I saw everything I needed to know. I felt the sincerity of his words and the depth of his love. "Yes," I said, tears filling my eyes. "Yes, I will." The months after our engagement were filled with excitement and planning. We decided to keep it simple, focusing on what mattered most: our love, our future, and the life we were building together. I learned that love wasn't about perfection or grand gestures. It was about choosing each other every day, even when things weren't easy. We spent weekends sorting through wedding plans, choosing a small venue, and writing our vows together. We talked about our hopes for the future, where we wanted to live, how we envisioned our lives, and the family we wanted to build. Every conversation, every moment spent together, felt like a step forward. And as the day of our wedding approached, I couldn't help but feel immense gratitude. For the first time, I truly understood what it meant to love and be loved. It wasn't about a fairy tale. It was about two people choosing each other, again and again, through the highs and lows. And that was more than enough. The morning of our wedding was perfect. The sky was a soft blue, and the air felt light and fresh. I couldn't believe the day had finally arrived. I stood in front of the mirror, adjusting my veil, feeling both nervous and excited. My best friends surrounded me, helping me get ready and laughing together as we reminisced about old memories. It felt surreal, but in the best way. Luke was calm, too, waiting for me at the altar. I could almost feel the warmth of his love, even from afar. I was no longer the woman who had been betrayed, scarred by the past. I was someone new, someone whole, because of him. As the music began to play and I walked down the aisle, I saw his eyes light up. And in that moment, I knew this was right. This was where I was supposed to be. Standing before Luke, I felt my heart swell with gratitude. As I looked at him, I remembered everything we had been through to get here. The pain, the healing, the growth. Every step had led me to this moment. I vow to stand by you through all of life's challenges, I began, my voice steady despite the emotions threatening to overwhelm me. I promise to be your partner, your confidant, and your greatest supporter. I will love you, honor you, and cherish you, not just in the good times, but in every moment we share together. His eyes were filled with tears as he took my hands in his, and his voice was thick with emotion as he spoke. I vow to always choose you, to always be there for you. I will love you through every storm and sunshine, and I promise to create a future with you, one that is full of laughter, love, and endless memories. In that moment, I felt like we had built something unbreakable, a bond that could withstand anything. We were no longer defined by the past, but by the love we shared in the present. The reception was everything I had hoped for, simple, intimate, and full of love. Surrounded by our closest family and friends, we danced, laughed, and celebrated the new chapter of our lives. It wasn't about the fancy decorations or the extravagant wedding cake. It was about the people who had supported us through everything, and the promise of a future that was full of hope. As the night went on, we danced our first dance as husband and wife. The song played softly in the background, but all I could hear was the rhythm of our hearts beating together, in sync. For the first time, I didn't feel like I was just surviving. I was living a life full of love, promise, and endless possibilities. And as I looked into Luke's eyes, I realized that this was the love I had always been waiting for. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and it was ours.